We're on.
All right, I'm gonna wait just a minute to start the meeting until I see more people come in as attendees. I'm seeing a couple of people joining us. All right, it looks like everybody's in who wants to get in. So good morning, I guess it still is, everyone, and welcome to our November meeting of the Boulder County Regional Opioid Council. I'm gonna kick it off here with just having everybody who's with us on the screen this morning introduce themselves and state what department or agency they represent. And Robin, if you could start.
Good morning, Robin Bohannon with Boulder County Community Services.
Kelly.
Hi, good morning. Kelly Veit. I use she, her pronouns. I'm also with Boulder County Community Services.
Anjali.
I'm Anjali Nambi with probation.
Hey, Curtis.
Good morning, Curtis Johnson, Boulder County Sheriff.
Jim.
Morning, Jim Adamsberger, also Boulder County Community Services Department.
Nuria.
Hi, Nuria Rivera Vandermeide. I am the city manager for the city of Boulder.
Susan.
Hey everyone, Susan Caskey with Boulder County Housing and Human Services.
And Lexi.
Lexi Nolan with Boulder County Public Health.
Great, and we have Barb Halpin who's helping us behind the scenes facilitate this meeting. So I'm gonna turn it over to Robin to go ahead and take us through the agenda.
Great, and I'm going to hand it off over to Kelly, who's our master of ceremonies today.
Thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. All right, so welcome again, everyone, to the November meeting of the Boulder County Opioid Regional Council. To get us started on a recap of our agenda, so first, our virtual meeting guidelines. And so this is a meeting where it is open to members of the public. However, it's not a public hearing. And so thank you to our members of the public for attending. And if you do have a burning question, comment, or concern, we do welcome you to put those into the chat. However, please know that those comments will not be added into the dialogue or conversation today with council members. Also, please make sure to mute your microphones and turn your cameras off. So for today's meeting, we're going to start with a little bit of updates, primarily around the contract for the evaluation and facilitation contractor. This is completed as of this week, so we'll kind of queue up what is the order of particular priority, work items that we're going to be starting with them next week. And then I will give a snapshot of our continuation funding process. We started this discussion at our last meeting in September. So October found us meeting with all of our programs to glean some additional information so that we could figure out exactly what awards we wanted to extend to those programs in 2024. So I'll talk through that process. I will also talk through the process of submitting our annual funding plan, which was just submitted to the state this Wednesday, November 15th. So I'll go over sort of our method and our approach for the dollar amount that we requested to draw down from the state for 2024. And then we'll have some dialogue, some discussion around new guidance from the state on particular funding investments. So just some new information that has come forth from some of the COEC committees on funding particular investments. So in terms of updates, so we have contracted finally with our our facilitation and evaluation contractor, Third Horizon Strategies. That has been executed earlier this week. We are going to start working with them. Staff are going to start working with them as of next week, and then they will be folded into the operations groups. Next meeting, which is to be determined, it is actually falling the day after Thanksgiving, so we're rearranging it to the beginning of December, but they will be joining us when we get back together with our ops group. So in that same vein, I just wanted to give a snapshot of the three kind of buckets that THS or Third Horizon Strategies will be working on with us. The first area is really process facilitation. So they will be doing interviews with our current board members, operation board members, to say what's been working throughout this process, what's not working, what are some areas that we can improve, just the function, roles, responsibilities of this group itself, the operations group itself. They will be helping us focus on a short-term objective of developing our high-level priority areas before March, so that we have that opportunity. Should we make any other decisions to draw additional funds down, we would be able to do so by that March 15th amendment date. So we're really sort of pinging that short-term objective against that deadline. And then March and ongoing, they will be helping us with longer term objectives that are really the kind of nitty gritty funding frameworks that incorporate our strategic priorities that we'll be developing with them. They're also going to be hosting a number of in-person sessions. They have 2 that are sort of already on the radar, although the exact date is to be determined, looking at December and March to really start pulling together not just the operations group, but a extended cohort, potentially members of this group if we want to fold that in, and also members of the public. Community engagement is the second sort of bucket that they will be helping us with. A roster build out of the opioid operations group, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about next. They'll also be doing an environmental scan and making recommendations on additional voices that we want to include both in the operations group, as well as call forward specifically or do direct engagement or outreach to when we do more community member convenings. And then also a specific engagement approach for some of our known community coalitions that are really strong in this space and that we want to formalize more of our partnership with. The SWAG is one that has been, Substance Use Advisory Group, that has been mentioned in this space a lot. And we know that we do want to formalize some level of ongoing engagement with that group and all of the subject matter experts that participate in that group. So that'll be part of their goal in helping us formalize that in that community engagement piece. And then evaluation. So this is sort of the other part of their contract. So they'll be looking across the currently funded programs and making recommendations on key performance indicators for those programs. They'll also be doing some asset mapping of gaps, resources, and other available funding sources. I think we've talked in this space a lot about making sure that we know any of the programs that we're funding. Is this really the most appropriate funding route, or are there other channels that can either be blended to support some of these interventions, or maybe move some of these interventions to different funding channels that might be more appropriate. So they're going to help us do a scan of those other funding opportunities. Also looking at impact measurement. So how are we knowing that our programs are successful across current programs, but also against known public health indicators and data sources, and then making recommendations for ongoing evaluation approaches so that we can continue to look at the impact of our programs and our interventions moving forward. I'll pause there and see if there's any questions or comments about sort of the general overview of the work with Third Horizon strategies. Okay. Great. Oh, yeah, Lexi, I see your hand.
You know what? I'm going to hold my question for later. Thanks.
Okay. All right, sounds good. And so just want to actually ping off of one of the areas that I just mentioned, the roster build out for the opioid operations group. So this was actually a discussion that we had with the operations group itself in our September meeting, and really just said, you know, who's missing in this space as we start to move into more of this strategic planning direction, and then also taking into account some of the shifting in roles that I had mentioned in this space at our last meeting, which is that ideally we're moving to a space of getting ideas about investments and what's needed in the community, that's really being driven by community members themselves. So how do we shift this dynamic so that the community is really generating an idea of where we want to invest, and then the operations group is serving as that sort of additional filter or lens of subject matter expertise that can really kind of refine what some of those recommendations from community members are and put them forward into a set of cohesive strategies and or recommendations to this group. And so some of the feedback that the group gave, or some of the themes that came out of that conversation, is that the opioid operations group, as it is right now, is a bit limited in terms of voices or individuals who are able to speak across all of the approved spending areas, and it doesn't lack that community representation. And so we want to expand that diversity in voices. Also, just a note that, again, this is part of the work that the incoming contractor THS will be facilitating, both with internal staff and continuing to take these recommendations and feedback from the operations board as they do a more complete scan of who needs to be at the table while we start more of the strategic planning process. Some other feedback that came up is to potentially consider an application process. So there are some regions that have an application process whereby they're able to put the word out to community members and say, you know, we have seats that are available for this committee. Here's what we do. Here's what we're looking for, and to have individuals that are interested apply to hold a seat on this board. So it's just an option that we've considered, and looking at other regions that do that as well. And then finally, some feedback to get creative about ways to include folks with more of that life experience. So, you know, have opportunities to hold meetings and off, you know, different hours, not necessarily 9 to 5. It doesn't work for everyone. Make sure to offer some level of compensation. This has been a big conversation across all of the regions that want to include more individuals with life experience on their boards. However, we're somewhat limited in how we can compensate. I think we're really kind of held to those gift cards. And so the feedback was, you know, work with these individuals to understand what is really meaningful in terms of compensation and recognition to them, so that it's not just, you know, a gift card, but it's really what are the ways that they're hoping to really fold into this in a meaningful way, and then honor that in coming up with a creative way to compensate their time. Any questions about the roster build out of the ops group? And you'll probably hear more about this as we have something more concrete, because just a reminder, any additions to that operations group do need to be approved by this council. So continuation funding. So this is a conversation that we started at our September meeting, and I just wanted to make you aware of some of the additional work we have done throughout the month of October and November, really to get an understanding of what dollars need to go out to those programs from last year to really sustain them. So just a reminder, our rationale for this decision making was we did not have included in our funding agreements last year a super robust requirement around outcome reporting. And we do not yet also have our longer term strategic priorities to sort of base our continued funding decisions around. And so because we have some additional funding coming out in 2024, we figured, you know, let's sustain the programs that we carried, or excuse me, that we funded last year. And primarily let's look at what their spending patterns were. So we have an understanding, did they spend their dollars? Did they request too little, too much? And also really looking at where is there a surplus. So we want to know, you know, if a program was given $100,000 last year, but they've only spent 80 by the end of this year, they have a $20,000 surplus, and we'll take that into account as we sort of refill that tank back up to the original amount for 2024. So a few things to note, and we had mentioned this last time, but just carried it forward in our interviews with all of the grantees. So we did eliminate any of the requests that were specifically one-time funding requests. There were just a few. And then also, again, these are sustainability focused extensions for this 2024 year. So really making it clear that unfortunately at this time, these are not expansion focused funding opportunities. And so really the only area that we're hoping, or that we were extending an increase in funding, is around personnel. And you'll hear me mention that a few times. I think we had decided that 3% cost of living increase to any of the funding that was dedicated to personnel. So we just automatically added that across the board to anyone's budget in the personnel section. And then in our meetings with each of these agencies, we were also able to suss out some other nuances around personnel cost such as if folks got a raise in the last year or reclassified. So pulling those forward in our conversations one-on-one with the agencies or the program so that we can honor any of those increases in personnel costs. So a little bit more detail on what this process looked like. Again, we were really looking at it. Oh yeah, Lexi.
Sorry, thanks, Kelly. I know that the commissioners are planning on a 2% merit also, and I was wondering if we want to consider that on add-on in addition to the COLA.
Ooh, that is a great point. I might defer on that one to Robin. I'm not sure how we would logistically go about that, but something to take into consideration. I don't know, Robin, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think because the commissioners have provided direction on what that performance merit bonus should look like, or merit to base, and it won't be applied until the July payroll. And the directors are meeting with our county administrator, talking about how he would determine that increase. It might be, Lexi, it's just a thought, and I'd have to think more deeply about it, but that we revisit the question and amend a contract if the merit, if staff are getting that merit, because it'll be applied differently because it's based on performance. And Claire, I see your hand up.
Yeah, my thought on this would be that I would look at these funds as being distributed the way grant funding typically is distributed, and questions about merit increases and salaries and all of those things should be incorporated into the grant request, and that we as funders of grantees out of these special revenues would not really be in a position to make decisions about and segregate out merit raises. It just doesn't feel like a place where we ought to be, where we're just distributing grant funds. They should request what they need to fairly compensate their staff and put that in their grant request. That's the way I would look at it right now. I think when we get to the question of ongoing funding and what is the appropriate amount to increase a grant for the same services, just looking at increasing compensation, I think there, again, what we ought to just arrive at an escalator. Like I see the 3% increase. I think that's typical, and that's probably where I would draw where I would come down, and not try to sort out how much of that is COLA and how much of that is merit. I think that's merit increases ought to be funded from the resources of the organization.
Lexi, did you have a follow-up?
No, thank you.
Okay, any other questions about that piece? All right. So just a little bit more detail about some of the steps for developing these funding amounts. Again, that first piece is looking at reporting of expenditures for Q1 through 3, and then projecting out based on that spending trend or burn rate, what the Q4 spend down would look like. That really is how we got to our understanding of what the surplus might be for programs as they enter into 2024. So we are able to then subtract that surplus from the total amount as we incorporated it into next year's award. We also had the opportunity to meet with all of our programs and ask them some of these nuances to make sure that our projections are correct and to make sure that we had the full story behind any of their spending patterns. We also wanted to know, is there anything that you anticipate being majorly different in terms of your your spending patterns in the Q4? So will you be hiring someone new, or is something new happening that would dramatically change this sort of trend? And so working with those programs to get a closer and more accurate projection of what they will be ending the year with in terms of a surplus. And then finally, of course, we added that 3% cost of living increase to anything personnel related. So a little bit more about the interviews. So we did have these focused on determining the spend patterns, but also the continued need for these dollars from programs. So we did ask, how is the spending going? What were the challenges? Was it enough? Was it too little? Have you found other sources of funding or other ways to sustain this intervention or programming? And then we also asked specific questions that you all, council members, brought forward in our last discussion around, really wanting to hear about their experience. Is the demand for the service what they anticipated? Are the dollars meeting the demand? Did it exceed the projected funding ask? So really, was this the right fit for the right intervention in terms of what was originally requested in 2023? And then also from our interviews, we were able to pull forward anything that looked like a bit of a scope change. So some programs saying, we want to take the same amount of dollars, but we want to spend it a little bit more like in this space, a little bit less in this space. So we sort of categorized anything that was a scope change and then combed through those one by one to figure out what's really allowable, what's really something that we feel comfortable approving at BCCS and saying, this really hasn't changed the intervention. It's maybe a shift in some of your budget areas, but nothing is super divergent from what you had originally approved from the Regional Council in 2023. And so we wanted to, categorize those ones and make decisions about those. And then also pull forward, are there other programs where the scope change is different enough or divergent enough that maybe we want to get it in front of you all, council members, to reapprove. Whoops. So an example of some of those types of questions or scope changes that were coming forward and how we kind of classified them as, these are okay. This is something that is an adjustment that's reasonable versus requests that are not reasonable or something that we can accommodate at this point in time. So reasonable requests, a lot of requests to move funds between some of their operational and their personnel expenses, but really mostly staying budget neutral, and they don't alter the scope of the actual intervention that was approved by the ROC in 2023. Also, again, personnel expense increases required to sustain certain staff. So a lot of reclassifications and new policies around classifications changed in 2023. So there were a number of staff for whom were affected by those reclassifications, and we did carry those forward and then honor those staff increases. And then a couple of awards had no spend and are not able to spend their dollars at all in 2023 for various reasons. And so in those cases, those programs were simply asking for a no cost extension on current awards. So those are some of the things that we saw as permissible and allowable things that we could do and approve in-house. Some of the other requests, I'll pause. I saw Susan's hand go up.
Thanks, Kelly. Is it worth us understanding what some of those barriers were to spend stuff down, or is it mostly staffing or?
Yeah, it's mostly staffing. And I'll talk about that a little bit next, but it's mostly staffing because of when the awards landed. And then also the, it's the word I'm looking for, the uncertainty of the length of time that the funding would be going on caused a lot of challenges in being able to recruit for particular positions. In terms of some of those no cost extensions, some of those had to do with having a subcontract embedded within their funding award and not being able to execute that contract in the amount of time that they thought. And so the service has not yet started.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And Lexi, is your hand back up or is that one from earlier? Okay, just making sure. And then some of the other requests that we unfortunately are not able to accommodate right now were requests to change or alter the scope of the current 2023 award so that it would allow for easier spend down. I think because some programs, as we went into this knowing that the surplus would be taken into account for their 2024 award naturally wanted to know if they were allowed to then move things around and maybe spend down differently so that they would end up with less of a surplus entering 2024. Unfortunately, that really wasn't the intention of how we kind of modeled this. We really wanted to get a fair understanding of what are the dollars they're actually using to stand up the intervention that was approved by you all last year. And then other requests that came forward were expansion focused, which, as I mentioned, we were not also the intention of this funding cycle. So a lot of our programs were able to do amazing things, and you'll hear some of our success stories. It's truly awesome how much was accomplished in such a short period of time. And so naturally programs saying, you know, with a little more dollars, we could serve more individuals, then there's more demand. However, those are requests that we did not take into account at this juncture. Camera just doesn't want to move forward today. Okay. So a little bit about the trends in what came forward from our interviews. First up, the challenges, funds landing late. As I mentioned, this just created a problem primarily with getting individuals into the roles that were funded. So there shifts needed to be made around staffing projections as the year went on. Some of the positions, without having a clear understanding of what would happen at the end of these awards, it was really difficult to recruit individuals into some of these roles. The funding landscape also had some significant changes that were affecting some of our programs this past year, primarily our treatment-focused programs, changes in Medicaid coverage, benefits that are altered now due to post-COVID rollbacks, really affecting treatment rates, demand, and ability to pay. Also dependency on settlement dollars. Again, this was another one that has to do with just not understanding or not having a clear trajectory of when these funds would sort of end. And so folks needing to get really creative about thinking through how do we blend this with other sources to make some of our positions, you know, carry forward, or to have them have a little bit more predictability. And so just that unpredictability element was really creating the need to get creative in funding positions. Need for care and acuity have risen. We heard this from a number of programs across the board, across the spectrum of interventions. One case that we had heard particularly from our criminal justice focused partners is that post-COVID jail numbers are back on the rise, and therefore folks that are in need of treatment in that space are up as well. So that was a space we heard a lot of, you know, our demand is really exceeding what we can keep up with some of these dollars. And then also, again, across the board, hearing that there might be fewer clients engaging in some of our programs, but those who are staying on the programs or the interventions for longer because they have a higher acuity suite of needs. And so, again, kind of saw that echoed throughout. And then finally, a lot of folks, again, this has to do with staffing, really want longer contracts. So the ability to have 2 or 3 year funding cycles and how do we model that into our approach was really something that the grantees were hoping for, so that there was continuity for staffing. I'm going to pause. I saw a few hands go up.
Oh, thanks, Kelly. Mine is just a quick question, on how long it is taking us to get the funding out. Typically, what is that time period or that gap between? Yeah.
Absolutely. So great question. So last year, our funds started to land in April and some even in May. So it took the whole first quarter to really do that contracting process. However, we are in that contracting process right now. So all of these continuation funds, they're already moving forward to funding agreement stages. And so our projection is to have them start on that calendar year, the first of the year, and have them be for a calendar year moving forward. A lot of the delay last year was just first time big learning curve in how to get these funds out the door correctly. Nuria?
Yeah, a quick question. I'm finding this all fascinating. So thanks for compiling. And as we're looking at the trends, and maybe I'm jumping the gun and there's more later, but love to see these challenges. And I wonder if there were also trends or indicators of what has been working well, so that perhaps, as I think about the city, what I can look at and see what we may need to shift existing programs to maximize some of the interventions that we think are doing well. And maybe we're going to get an executive report or something, but I was curious about whether there were any highlights of trends that were showing good progress yet.
Yeah, absolutely. So perfect segue. Positive impact trends. So we did have
Jumping the gun.
no, it's perfect. So we did have a lot of programs that first and foremost are just super grateful for the funding. I think the amount of latitude and flexibility in what we can fund, and this is kudos to the state and how they set this up, is there's a lot of flexibility. And we heard from a lot of programs that there are elements of their interventions or programming that they have just been consistently challenged with getting funding for from other funding sources, whether they be state or federal sources. Just the requirements and all the compliance can sometimes not allow them to fund some of their programming. So that latitude in this space has been really powerful in getting some of our smaller, more grassroots nonprofits funded in ways that they were consistently challenged in the past. Some of our positive impacts of note specifically from programs, Nico mentioned that some of the licenses around their interdiction tools have shown to take over 150,000 fentanyl pills, removed from the illicit drug supply in the community. So he has reporting on that he said he would be happy to share. Others are a little bit more trends around programs that were able to partner together, either with each other or with other programming within their region to expand partnerships and collaborations. So one example of that is the LEAF program, which has been able to partner to start a new MAT program out of Lyons, where there has been no MAT service to date, and it's a rural community. And so some of this funding has really given them the leverage to start some really critical partnerships and collaboration in that space. Again, expanding access to SUD care within rural communities. Another example of that MAT expansion with Lyons or LEAF, in Lyons by LEAF. More MAT availability in Boulder and Longmont. This was actually one of the interventions from MHP. So they were able to expand into Longmont in a way that they haven't been able to do in the past. So it's their first real presence of being able to offer MAT up in Longmont. So that was a great success. And then general expansion of prevention, treatment, and recovery supports for youth and families. It's been a space that's come up anecdotally as needing more support for a while now. And there were a number of programs that were really geared towards that demographic and focused on that, engaging that group of individuals. So a lot of good feedback that we were able to engage folks that we haven't been engaging as much as we should in the past. And then better support for those involved in the criminal justice system. I'll pause. Claire, I see your hand went up.
Yeah, this is, I don't know, this slide is really great to know that these funds are having an impact. And I'm wondering about community expectations. Robin brought this up in a totally different meeting earlier this week, and just managing community expectations around when can we expect to see a difference in the perceptions of the magnitude of the problem, or maybe it's not even limited to the perceptions of the magnitude of the problem. When can we, and is it even realistic to expect to see a change in what is being reported from a growing crisis, increasing overdoses, increasing jail populations of people who are addicted and have various forms of SUD? And because that's not what we're hearing, and that's not the word on the street. And I want to be realistic about what we're able to do with the dollars we have. So how do we manage those expectations? And what is a realistic outcome to expect here?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I know that our awards for last year were relatively short in length. So some of these agencies or programs have only had funding for 6 or 9 months at this point. It was one of the reasons that we were intentionally lean on having a really robust outcome reporting attached to some of these funding agreements. However, one of the things that we see as the opportunity of having these longer term contracts, potentially multiple year funding contracts, is not just the sustainability of staff positions, but the ability to put realistic performance metrics on any of our programs, because some of these trends would take multiple years to really move in the direction that we want to see impact. And so hearing that from our programs, we can't show a significant impact on XYZ, whatever it might be particular to that program, in a short period of time. So what's a more realistic period of time to give them dollars, and then a realistic sort of measurements to ping into that time period so that they can showcase progress and improvements more broadly to the community. I see a couple more hands went up, but I don't know in what order. And Claire, did that help at all?
And I'll say
Yeah,
Lex
it does. I think this is just going to be an ongoing issue of, we've got these monies. What are they doing? When will we see a change? And what do we actually think we can do? And that's part of, I know that we're at the very beginning of what will be a lengthy period of time with these funds. So I'm just hearing that now, and having this slide and this information is really, really great. And I think we just have to deal with that community expectation issue. Yeah. And on my screen anyway, Lexi's hand was up next.
Claire, I think your point is really well taken, and I think managing community expectations in this space is going to be critical, because the reality is that this money, as important as it is, in the whole system of what's influencing this challenge in our community, is a drop in the bucket, and we don't really have a lot of control over an awful lot of the drivers of this epidemic and all of its consequences. Drawing a straight line for the opioid funding to outcomes, I think, is going to be super challenging. I think output measures are going to be one of our most important tools, and also being able to create clear communications with the community about everything that's influencing the trends in our community. From, is China going to really sign this agreement to try to curtail fentanyl distribution in the United States? Is that real? To, what's happening at the state level, to, all kinds of other things, to also, we're investing this money in whatever now, but we don't expect to see an impact for 3 years down the road because of X, Y, and Z, or things like. I think the communication is absolutely critical. So thanks for raising that.
Yeah, and to that point, Lexi, I mean, one of the things that you've heard me talk about our work with the contractor, and of course how they're going to help us kind of come up with performance metrics for different programs. Another piece is that communication piece. So the communication plan, what's our method for getting the word out? What is the means whereby we're continuing to engage? Are we putting out annual reports of where our funding has gone into what programs? How do we beef up the information on our website? So all of that transparency elements that we're keeping the public sort of brought along on this is also something that we're going to be working on pretty closely with that contractor.
Naraya, please. I think you've been waiting.
Oh, yep. Well, and again, it's all in the same vein, right? I too am excited to see the positive impacts. It's hard, and I know that you're bringing to us the high level view. It's hard to know the context. So there's expanded access to SUD care. It went from what to what, right? Like, it's hard to see if that's like just one more program or is it incrementally more. And it's the context setting that I think, and I'm not, if this is not a criticism or a fault, but this is great. And I think there's another layer of that. And I think it goes to the communication aspect. So really happy to hear, what does that look like? And whether or not it's coming on the horizon, that would be good to know. And if not, I would just say that I think that context setting, what does more mat availability mean, right? What existed, what can we do? Because it's hard to keep people's expectations right if it's too general. And so, and it's hard, frankly, to in the future is, and obviously this is a marathon, not a sprint, right? We know that we're going to see hopefully more changes in the future. So we got to be thinking about that as we move forward. But the incremental steps that are leading to that are also important in the short term, because I, like Claire and like many of you, are hearing like, what has this group been doing and up to, and what are we seeing from that? Because people just expect millions of dollars to make immediate change, right? And that is not how it works. So anyway, if you're contemplating more context and more depth to this positive impact, I love it. And if not, I might recommend that we think about how to put that in more context so that we can champion efforts that are ongoing and set expectations that this is the incremental pathway to some bigger changes we hope to see in the future.
Yeah, I think these are all really good points. And I do believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Kelly, that the contractor is going to do that system service mapping to identify, it's sort of like we don't have our baseline. So to identify that as well as the resources. So hopefully that will provide more data for that incremental story that we can tell.
Yeah, that's correct. So one of the bigger components, although one of many, that has been brought forward a lot is the behavioral health roadmap and other community health needs assessments that have been done recently. So sort of to ping off of what we already know about the gaps, but to really map out what's our ideal state, what's our current state, what's our baseline, what are our intended impacts of these programs, what's our suite of strategies and our really priority areas, and what do we hope to do with those investments. So kind of helping us build that entire story from end to end so that we can talk about it more with community members. Other questions on positive impacts or the challenges that were brought forward in these program interviews? Okay. Oops. So switching gears a little bit, I'm going to talk about what we put into our annual funding plan with the state. This was due to the state on Wednesday of this week on the 15th. And so hot off the press, what we put into that for our annual funding plan. As a reminder, the COST system is the name of that online system that we put our annual funding plan into. And I also want to preface this part of the conversation with there's a lot of flexibility that we have in how to move these funds around even after that plan has been submitted. So it's something to keep in mind. Really, there are a couple of blackout dates throughout the year, really around our reporting periods that we are not allowed to use funds, or excuse me, move funds. But outside of those blackout dates, we really have a lot of flexibility. So what you'll see next is not necessarily set in stone. It's not concrete. This is our best ability to pull down a reasonable amount of funding from what we have available and have it tied into an approach that mirrors our relative priority areas as a region. So where did we start? So this slide will look familiar to you. This is a recap of an exercise that we asked our operations group members to do in September. And really the exercise was, we took the 76 or 77, that full list in the appendix of the MOU, the state's MOU, the full list of programs or interventions that are approved for abatement spending And we distilled those down into 11 different areas that we called theme areas for this particular exercise. We asked operations group members to take 100 imaginary points and to apply them across the 11 theme areas, and to really say in terms of what they saw as the highest need or the highest priority area. So the top priorities that came forward, probably no surprise to folks, treatment, general treatment programming and interventions, as well as those focused on the criminal justice population. Recovery, prevention, and harm reduction are also some of the larger programming buckets that came out from the exercise as our highest priority areas. So I'll tell you what we did with those percentages, but first a little bit of framing. So in terms of requirements and expectations from the state, there is no requirement or penalty to draw down all of our dollars within any time period or to spend them. There is the ability to roll funds over year to year and to keep some of the funds, to not even draw down some funds that are available to us, but to keep them sort of in the bank, so to speak. And in fact, the state has indicated that it's preferable that if we don't have a means to spend the dollars that we're drawing down, that we're only pulling down the amount that we reasonably think we have a strategy or a method to spend within the time period that they need to be spent, or excuse me, within that time period, that funding period. And as a reminder, we are already in our, well, 2024 will be our second year of that 2-year period. So keeping in mind that we have to do expenditure reporting on an annual basis, we don't want to draw down more funds than we can reasonably spend and then have to report a large surplus at the end of the year. So that said, we have this amount that is available to us in 2024. It's $4.4 million approximately. Minus from that the $1.5 million that are going out the door for continuation funds, left us with about 2.9 million to sort of play around with and figure out how much of this do we want to draw down, and how do we apply that to the priority percentages and roll that back up into our cost categories. So the number that we landed on to draw down and to move this exercise forward was $2 million. And the reason for that, there's a couple of reasons. Again, it's better to keep funds in the bank and to continue to roll them over than to draw down more than we have a method or a strategy to spend within the year. We also have a lot of that flexibility that I mentioned to move funding around. So 2 million gives us a nice kind of round number baseline to work with, but we don't have to spend that much, and we can spend more than that if we would like. Some of those decisions around the types of programming that we're going to put out RFPs for example, or other funding opportunities. Once we have those details, we can move, one direction or the other from that $2 million mark. Just gives us a nice place to start from, and it keeps a fair amount in that bank moving forward. It also aligns with what we can anticipate being funded on an annual basis moving forward. So this year being a bit of a windfall, we do know that our annual projection for 2025 and forward is still around $1.8 million. And so if we're drawing down 2 million this year and really working with that, it keeps us close to that threshold of what we can expect to be seen on an annual basis, so that we can have a stronger basis for sustainability. Let's see, what else could I say about that $2 million mark? Are there any questions on why we chose $2 million as our drawdown amount? Oh, that's what I wanted to say. One more reminder is that anything that is remaining in the bank, we can draw down at that March 15th amendment period. So if between now and March we have other means come together and we say, we actually want to draw down all of our dollars. We have all these different RFPs and funding priorities now that we've figured out in the next few months. We do have that opportunity come March 15th, should we make a decision to draw down more funding.
Kelly, can I just add?
Yeah.
Because this is a little bit confusing, I think, unless you're kind of in it and doing the work. But these allocation amounts based on those percentages, that's just a way to park money until we decide what programming we actually want to spend it on. So the state requires us to put money into these buckets, and then we use that as guidance to say, here are the things that we want to spend. Do we have enough money in that bucket, say for criminal justice treatment services? So it's a little bit of a misnomer to think of this as being actually programs that we're funding. We're just putting money in these buckets so that then we can draw from those in providing contracts and services related to those different categories. So I'm not sure if that helped clarify, but it is a little bit confusing to kind of understand that process.
And Kelly, can I ask if, are there expected more settlements happening that would change that 1.8 million annual number?
Not that I am aware of. Jim, I don't know if you have any more information, but I don't have on my radar any that are anticipated to land in the near future and draw that dollar amount up at all.
Yeah, I think there actually are additional settlements in the works. And we can provide that information in a subsequent meeting.
So this is a little bit more of like folding up into those broader categories that Jim mentioned. So, you know, the last slide, I just wanted to give a little justification why we played around with this $2 million drawdown amount. What we did with that $2 million, going back to that prioritization exercise with the operations group, is we applied the 2 million across the percentages that were in that pie chart that you just saw. And then any of the programs that were nested within those theme areas, we totaled out the amount and rolled them back up into where they are represented within those 3 cost categories. So I know that's a bit confusing, but it's a lot of nesting of different programs. And essentially we took the amounts and rolled them back up to treatment, prevention, or additional areas, which are the 3 cost system categories. Where we landed is $1.1 million for treatment, $525,000 for prevention, and $320,000 for additional areas. Again, all have wiggle room to move, but this was what we did put into our cost system on the 15th. So our total that was entered into cost is about 3.7 million. And you can see in parentheses what's represented there, the 1.5 million in continuation funding, 2 million, this number that we determined to kind of to work with for allocations in 2024, and then 200 for the administration and that contract for evaluation moving forward. I'll pause again and see if this got any more clear or maybe more muddy, I'm not sure.
Kelly, I think you answered my question in just saying that there is flexibility though, once you get proposals and if there's a different opinion about shifting more to prevention, for example, there isn't a percentage amount that it's capped that you can switch some of these to, right?
Absolutely. No, it's not capped. These are all flexible amounts. Really what we were just trying to generate for the plan and is some justification that pegged to our relative priority areas and was a realistic dollar amount that we could hope to spend in this funding cycle. So that's a lot of flexibility therein.
And Kelly, I'm sorry if I missed this, but the timing of the 2 million to allocate in 2024, is that for the long-term plan once we decide that, or is that something interim?
So the 2 million for 2024 would be for any of our long-term strategies. We haven't really figured out what our RFP process or competitive bid process will look like. But we do know that it's going to be happening in spring. We also know that we want to have a few directed funding opportunities for other priorities that kind of span the region. So there'll probably be at least 2 funding rounds in 2024. And I don't know, Jim, it looks like you came off mute if you want to say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so to remind us, we're in a 2-year funding cycle with the state. So we're going into year 2 of that funding cycle. And as Kelly was saying earlier, the state would like us to allocate the dollars we think we'll likely spend within that period of time. So the 2 million should be obligated or close to that amount within this next year, within the 2024 calendar year. But to her point earlier also, if we don't spend it, it doesn't really matter because it just rolls forward. But they want us to be somewhat realistic in setting expectations for how much we think we'll spend within a given 2-year cycle.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and a good point that Jim brought forward is the difference between obligated or being spent in a year. It's a conversation that we're continuing to have with the state because we have brought forward this feedback of we want to have multiple year grants. And so what does it look like if we were to fund something for 3 years, a 3-year funding cycle? How do we then report that on our 2-year or even annual expenditure reporting? Can we count these funds as out the door as soon as they're obligated? So some of that weedy nuance we're still working on with the state. Any other questions on this piece? All right. Okay, switching gears a bit. So we did receive some recent guidance from the state. There has been an ongoing discussion at the COAC, or excuse me, at the AG's office and their respective advisory and compliance committees that really regulate and monitor the use of abatement dollars. There's been some ongoing discussion around funding certain interdiction tools. And so we wanted to just carry that forward to you all to make you aware. So originally interdiction tools was a category that was included in the approved spending purposes. But as I mentioned, the Regional Abatement Assistance Committee, which is part of the COAC, has been discussing this for a while now and having some mixed feelings on whether or not some of our interdiction investments have really been in the spirit of what was originally intended with that language. So really analyzing if what's been funded is in the spirit of what they intended. They have discovered that they think the language was written too broad and should be tightened up in the future. Their guidance has indicated that the original intention for interdiction funding was not to fund tools dedicated to unlocking personal devices, and that they don't feel it's in alignment with how the settlement funds should be used. However, no final decisions have come from the state making these investments unallowable. It's just a contextual piece that we wanted to be aware of, as we do have a number of products that we are currently funding in the interdiction space. So any questions?
Just can I provide a little bit more context? So this actually came up at the national level. There's a kind of a watchdog group that's looking at all of the spending across all states. And in one of the sections of a report they wrote, they identified problematic areas of funding. And so Boulder was listed as a potential problematic area in the funding of these interdiction tools. Now, they are not the final say in what is acceptable, but it did raise a red flag for the state. And so then the state took a look at that and started just talking amongst themselves about whether or not this is an area that is allowable from their definitions of allowable funding. And I think to Kelly's point, what they basically came to the conclusion of, and they will continue to, I think, to explore this, is that while it's not prohibited, it's not in their sense the kind of spirit of the use of the dollars, that the dollars are intended to be used to really help people who have been impacted or community groups that have been impacted by the use of opioids. So I think it's just a question for us as a group to see, does this raise any concerns for us, or just is there additional conversation we want to have about that particular set of investments? Claire, it looks like your hand is up.
Yep, it is up. Yeah, just well, you know, I didn't see this as being in the spirit of these funds. But we did award them. There's no discussion, I take it, about requiring that to be repaid or to disallowing that as because it was originally allowed. And okay, this is what I'm hearing from both what Kelly and Jim are saying. But yeah, I mean, I think the direction that they're going here is consistent with what the spirit was, to really try to be in the community and affect those impacted and try to lessen the impacts and do harm reduction, do prevention, do treatment, all of that stuff. So, yeah.
Maria?
Yeah, I just, I just wanted to thank you for bringing this up to attention. I had not heard about it beforehand. And I knew we had questions when we were first starting with these fundings. Understandable, right? Is that moves forward? I also think that new programs are going to have rolling guidance as we move along. And now that we have it, it is continuing to be something thoughtful about how we use funds moving forward, and certainly a nod to make sure that we're continuing to ask ourselves, right? Like, to what end are we trying to use these funds, and those buckets that we have outlined previously, Kelly, that you were showing earlier, I think are really helpful as we think about it. But I also want to just lift up that I know that some of our friends who are working in the prevention part of the world, preventing incoming drugs into community is an intervention. And how do we support some of that, even though it may not be with funds of this nature, I think is an important conversation to have.
And Jim or Kelly, is it your understanding, so the state is going to continue to have this conversation, they will be informed by the national conversation. Is there any, are they seeking feedback from local rocks, or is there a way to have this conversation with them as it moves forward? Just curious about what that feedback loop might be.
Yeah, so they did solicit feedback from this Regional Abatement Assistance Committee, which is state level people that are a committee that advises the state COAC. And I think to Maria's point, there's some guidance that's not really fully clear. And so they will, because this was flagged at the national level, they will continue to have discussions about this. But the general feedback that came from members of that assistance committee was consistent with what Claire was saying, is that it's not allowable, but it's also perhaps not fully consistent with the vision for the use of these dollars. Now, whether or not that will result in some kind of clear guidance to say it can't be used for those purposes, not sure. All I know is that they will continue to have some dialogue at the state level around whether or not they want to clarify the guidance.
Yeah, I just was curious, is again, to Nerea's point, you know, if there are people who want to say, well, this is part of prevention and intervention, or to advocate either way, is there communication going to that statewide group from local rocks? And if we wanted to do that, what would that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is not, to my knowledge, and there is a monthly learning forum of the regions where we could raise this question to all the regions to say, is this an area of conversation we'd like to take on as a group? So that would be one way of trying to inform it at a broader level.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that there would be plenty of interest in hearing from regions that have funded some of these tools. What has the experience been? To Jim's point, and to answer your question, Robin, I don't know that there's been given any guidance on what that venue or what that, you know, where that conversation sits, but I think it would be welcomed if we wanted to had some support or justification or evidence, what have you, around this investment to carry forward.
CJ, I see your hand up.
Well, since it has to do mostly with policing, I should probably speak. And know that I wasn't a part of this group when those decisions were made. But we want to be very cognizant of how this money is being used in relationship to policing. And that is part of the national narrative that we're following, because there are other states, other venues where I think there are wildly inappropriate expenses being made by law enforcement agencies to buy staff or vehicles or guns or things to fight the opioid epidemic. And, you know, part of our piece really is that early intervention, getting our hands on drugs that are killing people, but also the follow-up piece of holding people accountable who are dealing drugs in our community that are harming people. And so, you know, we've tried to be very cognizant that this is a very small percentage of the funding and that it's a really small piece of the pie. It's useful tools, and I'd be curious and willing to participate if there is an opportunity to talk further about it. I totally get that it's right on the line of what people may think is appropriate or inappropriate use of these funds, but we're trying to be very careful about using them in a way that really does align with some of the spirit of holding people accountable for dealing deadly drugs in our community, and also trying to stop the flow of those drugs into our community. So with that said, you know, I realize this may get politically challenging, and if we have to ultimately decide not to fund that, that's okay. But it is a really small piece of the pie, and we have no intention of bringing forward, and I'm sure Nico has spoken about our conversations, Kelly. We're not trying to turn this into policing money. It's way different than that. And so we really don't have any intention of bringing anything else forward that would not be in alignment with the true spirit of this. I've said my piece.
Thanks for that. So we did include it in the continuation funding, those software packages. And does it make sense? Is it the group's will to say, let's fund it for those again for another year, and then we can see what additional guidance comes down from the state? Does that feel like a good kind of immediate step to take based on the fact that it still seems to be somewhat in a gray area? Lexi?
I'm kind of curious if we have any feedback yet on the effectiveness in intervening to prevent opioids from coming into the county.
Yeah,
So-
so in
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, in our conversations with Nico, he did have a lot of evidence to show. He actually mentioned that one particular case using the equipment resulted in confiscating and taking out of the illicit drug supply 150,000 fentanyl pills. And he said he had more evidence and more stories of that nature to share should we want to call them forward. So I think it's there and can be, we can illustrate some of the impact of these tools if we wanted to. Other thoughts or questions?
Just some last clarity, Kelly, I assuming this is more for informational purpose for us to have in our mind, and to have continued conversations about, and I just wanted to appreciate CJ, you sharing your perspective on it, as we had some of this conversation in our early decisions about funding or not, and this is always a sticky issue, right, as we move forward. So just appreciate your comments. But I'm just confirming, Kelly, that you're not looking for a decision right now. We're just, this is what's coming up, and we're going to have to continue to talk about it as we move forward.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. Yeah, and I do hear some good next steps in terms of being able to call forward any evidence for impact, or measures of impact from use of these tools, and then also getting more clarity from folks at the state. Is there a venue in which we should be having this conversation with a broader group, so that if we wanted to, call forward our programming and our investments and sort of showcase our use of them, what is the space to do that? So I'm seeing those as next steps we can carry forward as staff. Final thoughts on this before we move ahead. Okay. So just in our last couple minutes here, I did want to, oops, excuse me, I almost muted myself there. Did want to highlight an annual funding calendar. So this is something that has been requested in this space and in the operations group and by members of the public, is some sort of timeline or calendar for when individuals can expect new funding opportunities. And admittedly, it's been a bit of a moving target, difficult to kind of nail some of these dates down. However, the state recently put forth an annual funding calendar, which I'll go through. And then we as staff at Community Services were able to get together, talk about our own fiscal processes, reporting processes, contracting, et cetera, and come up with our own funding calendar as well. So hopefully this lends a little bit more guidance. So there's a lot going on in this visual. So just to preface this, preface with that top part is really the area that's probably most relevant for this group. The bottom part is a little bit more relevant for staff. But essentially what this shows is the timeline for when funds are distributed and when we are required to request those funds from the state. So two things I just want to point out here that are important to note is this idea that can get somewhat confusing around a 2-year funding cycle but an annual plan submission. So technically 2024 will be our second of our first 2-year plan. However, we do a new funding plan submitted to the state, annually, because there are new dollars that typically land within each year. And so everything that we put forward in the first year, we knew at the time that we were going to have this opportunity in 2024 to re-up some of the funds, to draw down additional dollars, to measure impact of current programs, and to sort of shift our funding investments around within that second year of the funding cycle. So another thing to point out is that our funding requests, you can see that they are going to decline in number as the years move forward. So our first year of funding last year, they did have a number of opportunities to submit an annual plan, September 15th, November 1st, and December 15th. That was really just because it was the first year, everything was so confusing, everybody was standing up a lot of processes. And so the state was able to give us ample opportunity to get our plans in and have them approved and draw down dollars. You can see in this year, it was originally just September 15th and March 15th, actually. That November 15th date, if you can recall, was actually added in September. So we did have that opportunity this year. Moving forward, they don't anticipate having additional funding opportunities outside of that September 15th date. So in 2025 and forward, our plan submissions will always be due on September 15th, with the amendment period on March 15th being the only other opportunity in that year to draw down additional funds. I'm going to pause there and see, is there any feedback on this slide as well? Actually, Jamie Feld at the state gave it to us a couple of days ago and said, please solicit feedback from your council members. Is this confusing? Is it helpful? What else would you like to see? And Lexi, I think your hand is up from earlier, but just checking. Okay.
Kelly, my only comment, and it's neither here nor there, but I think where it gets confused when we see the word funding, my mind went to our agencies asking us for funding, as opposed to this is us putting our cost allocation to the state. That's our request for funding, right? And I don't know if this is a public document or who this goes out to, but that would be my only thought is to really recognize that this is not when someone in the community could apply for funding from us.
Absolutely, that's a great point. So this is not public at this point. It's kind of hot off the press. Jamie gave it to us on the 15th and said, don't quite share yet, but solicit feedback on what could be changed. So happy to get that feedback back to Jamie as well. And so a little bit about how that does mirror to our own funding calendar. This is one that we developed, not quite as cool as the state's, but this is really to mirror what our process will look like in turn as we do have funding cycles. So this is what is anticipated to happen on an annual basis. The first of the year would really be closing out any contracts that are due at that period of time. As we get into multiple year funding cycles, if we have some that are on a 2 or 3 year funding cycle, it's possible we're not reviewing every contract towards the first of the year the way we had to do this year, because obviously that would be a rolling end date for our funded programs. Working with our contract department, our purchasing department very closely, and recognizing that May is usually when we would put out a competitive bid process. So whether that's an RFP or an RFA, we would really be looking at that start of spring as the timeline that makes the most sense to get out any news or open any competitive bids. And then have those bids selected, reviewed throughout the summer, and then contract throughout the fall. Now, this is just sort of like high level what we can expect. And one big caveat I will make is that we are still examining those opportunities for directed funding so that we're not just looking at that one procurement process come May 1st of every year. That will be sort of our milestone that stays steady. However, we do anticipate additional funding spaces or opportunities to be fused into this calendar year as well. So I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions. And this piece we are happy to get to the board if it helps to sort of review. All right. Yes, I see a hand. I don't know. Oh,
Just
all
me.
right.
Yeah, just a quick question, less about this calendar. I think it's super easy to view and whatnot. I was wondering if, but I know that you're continuing work with a consultant, if between now and maybe some of that March timeframe where we're making some of these revisions and thinking about funding in a different way, if we will be able to have some insight into, as a board, into some of those consultant, some more details into that consultant report, just thinking that might also help frame our minds when we're looking at potential new funding decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It is my intention to carry forward any of the work products or major kind of deliverables from that space. Because that's really going to be kind of our compass moving forward. And some of the recommendations that they make are also going to be fused with that environmental scan of what else is available, what's that broader context, how do we really plug that into our process of developing our own strategic priorities. So absolutely plan to carry forward anything that comes from those conversations and that work to this board. All right, I believe that is all I have for the group today, unless there's other items for the good of the group from the group.
We've got a little less than 10 minutes just for any general discussion that the group might want to have. Not seeing any hands go up. Robin, anything else you'd like to share, or Jim, before we end the meeting?
No, I just appreciate, Kelly, all the work and the transparency around how the funds are being used, as well as what we're learning from the state and national conversation. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and I'll add my thanks too. There's so much that is happening between our meetings that gets us to these meetings, and I know that we're all here for the same reason, which is to push these dollars out into our community effectively and try to turn the tide on what is ravaging our community. And you know, we've got not only the people here, but we have the operations group, we have the swag. So we're getting really good input on where to put these dollars, and I just, as I said earlier, I'm looking forward to when we can tell the community that it's making a difference, and when we really see that. And I don't want to be impatient about it, because it takes time, and as we've known from the outset, while the overall, the gross settlement dollars are very, very large numbers, the amount that we have here in Boulder County, while it's significant, it's money we didn't have before. It's nowhere close to what we need. So, but appreciate everybody's work on this, and I think we'll let you have a couple minutes back in your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you so much.